And now we would like to invite Professor Sara Lepton from History Faculty of the State University of New York to present her paper entitled Sight of the People, Jew as a Symbol, as Witness of Medieval Christian Art. Zapraszam panią profesor Sarę Lepton z Wydziału Historii Uniwersytetu w Nowym Jorku. Proszę o wygłoszenie referatu Żyd jako symbol i świadek w średniowiecznej sztuce chrześcijańskiej.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the Bishop and the Diocese of Sandomierzu for the invitation to speak today, and Professor Magda Tatar for organizing this visit, my first to Poland. As you can tell, I do not speak Polish. I will try to speak English slowly and clearly for those of you who can understand English, so you can follow me. And this is not in my text, but I would just like to say that Poland is a very beautiful country, and Sandomierzu is a remarkably beautiful city, and I am honored and pleased to be here. I also would like to say that in a world that focuses so much on the present, and sometimes seem to suffer from apathy and even willful, purposeful amnesia about human history, I deeply appreciate the commitment to acknowledging and learning from the past demonstrated by today's event. While looking backward can sometimes be painful, I think we all believe, that it is a necessary precursor to moving into the future with increased wisdom. Perhaps the primary lesson that I myself have drawn from studying the depiction of the Jew in medieval Christian art is that words and images, no matter how apparently innocent or well-intended, inevitably draw upon and further spread deep-seated and often unconscious ideas and associations. Only by uncovering and explicitly facing those ideas and associations can we hope to change age-old patterns of prejudice. It is my hope that my work, in a small way, and today's symposium as well, may help to start to bring about that change. So now to start. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, there were no recognizable Jews in Christian art. Christian manuscripts and monuments did depict Hebrew prophets and Israelite warriors and Judaic kings, but these figures were identifiable only by the context in which they appeared, and they were in no way visually singled out as different from any other sages, soldiers, or kings. The descendants of these biblical figures, that is, medieval Jews, made no appearance in Christian art at all. The only visual trace of the existence of another faith in Christendom was the female personification of Judaism known as synagoga, generally portrayed as a veiled and blindfolded woman standing in the shadow of the cross. Then, all of a sudden, shortly before the year 1100, the Jew emerged from artistic oblivion. At that time, the increased wealth and security of Christendom led to an image explosion, as expensive and elaborately decorated buildings and books spread across Europe. Art came to play a greater role in religious devotions, and Christian artists began to experiment with new techniques, styles, and types of image. Many of these images began, for the first time, to feature recognizable Jews. At first, prophets and Pharisees, and then eventually contemporary, that is medieval, Jews, became common sights in Christian artworks, and a host of visual cues were developed to render them first just recognizable and ultimately despicable. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Jew had become one of the most powerful and poisonous symbols in all of Christian art. This story is quite well known, at least to those of us who study medieval Christian art, but it has not yet been satisfactorily explained. It is very common for scholars to explain the growth in anti-Jewish imagery by citing Christian anti-Semitism. But in my view, this is too easy and not very accurate. For many centuries, Christians had critiqued Jewish rejection of Jesus and the Jews' literalistic reading of Scripture, and some Christians, though by no means all Christians, had doubtless even out-and-out hated Jews, but they did not articulate that critique or express that hatred in art. Moreover, the vast majority of Jewish images decorated artworks meant solely for Christian eyes. Artworks that appeared in places with few or with no Jews at all, and artworks made by people, overwhelmingly male monks and clerics, who were far more interested in Christian worship than in Jewish people or practices. Simply accusing these people of anti-Semitism tells us little about why these images were made or what they meant to the people who made them. So today, I'm going to offer a reading of Christian depictions of Jews that considers them in the context of Christian worship. I'm going to highlight an important, if rarely discussed, aspect of such depictions: the fact that a remarkable number of these images highlight not only what Jews look like, but even more how and whether Jews see. I argue that this new artistic emphasis on the Jew as viewer and as an object viewed is related to the traditional theological formulation of Jews' role in Christendom. Already in the letters of St. Paul, who lamented that Jews clung to what he called the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, Jews were linked to the physical, material, visible world. St. Augustine further developed this emphasis on Jewish materiality and visibility, writing that Jews were allowed to remain in Christian lands because they served as both witnesses to and living signs of Christian truth and triumph. Their scriptures predicted the coming of Christ, their very flesh affirmed his historical truth, and their subsequent subordinated state proved their error in not recognizing him. And for those of you who know the works of St. Augustine, this appears in Book 19 of the City of God. From early times, then, the Jews' function in Christendom was to see and to be seen. But we still need to examine why and to what effect, after 1,000 years of being invisible in art, the Jews' seeing and being seen began to feature so prominently in Christian art. I'm going to argue that it relates to changes in Christian devotional culture. As art, material objects, and the visible world became more central to Christian worship after the year 1100, each new development led to a new mobilization of the figure of the Jew, that long-standing symbol of vision and matter. The first images of identifiable Jews were far from negative. They appeared around the year 1085 in northeastern France and the German Rhineland, where reform-oriented Benedictine monasteries began to create large-scale illustrated Bibles featuring what we call author portraits of the Hebrew prophets at the opening of each biblical book. These Hebrew prophets were, for the very first time, made to look different from other biblical figures. They were all endowed with beards and with antique-looking pointed hats or caps. These signs had nothing to do with actual Jews' appearances or clothing. While Jewish males did tend to be bearded, so were most Christian men at the time, and there is no evidence that Jews wore hats of this kind, or indeed covered their heads at all in 11th century Europe. Rather, the pointed hats were modeled on the headgear of ancient Persian kings, and so they invoked the wisdom of the East and the authority of the ancient past. Portraying such venerable-looking prophets endowed the innovative manuscripts in which they appeared with an air of venerability and authority, and so helped proclaim that all the reformers' innovations, from the assertion of new papal powers to the creation of new artistic forms, were firmly grounded in ancient tradition. From the very beginning of the high medieval image explosion, then, Jews played a central role in Christian discussions of religious art and religious change. Within a few decades of the introduction of this kind of newly marked Hebrew, however, A different artistic innovation involved Jews in a more difficult and more heated discussion. Starting around the year 1100, Christian devotions began to focus far more intensely than previously on the crucifix. And it was apparently difficult for many Christians to look at the crucifix without thinking about the Jews. This is not only, or even primarily, because of the Jews' ostensible role in the death of Jesus. In fact, until the mid-12th century, Christ on the cross was generally shown alive and unharmed, and his executioners were rarely depicted. If any executioners were depicted, they were dressed as Roman soldiers or as yokels, as lower-class peasant-type people. Rather, as several texts from the early 12th century indicate, Jews figured in Christian meditations on the crucifix chiefly as opponents of visual devotion. Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury's famous theological treatise, Why God Became Man, Cur Homo Deus, complained that infidels, ridiculing our simplicity, charge us that we dishonor God when we affirm that he endured fatigue, hunger, thirst, stripes, and crucifixion among thieves, and they call our beautiful ideas about Christ merely like so many pictures. More explicitly, two polemical works, the English Abbot Gilbert Christian's Disputation Between a Christian and a Jew, and the German Abbot Rupert von Deutz's Dialogue of a Jew and a Christian, both feature Jewish characters who assert that Christian veneration of images, and most especially of the crucifix, amounted to idolatry. The charge clearly carried a sting. The same Hebrew scriptures that supplied Jews with their argument were, of course, also holy to Christians. These authors consequently worked very hard to justify the practice, citing Old Testament passages that seemed to support the creation of religious imagery, repeating long-standing Christian assertions that Scripture must be read allegorically rather than literally, and insisting that veneration of the crucifix could bring love and spiritual illumination to those who gazed at it correctly. But the rationalistic and text-based arguments favored in written polemics were not the only means by which Christians responded to Jewish criticisms of, and or their own doubts about, the role of images in Christian worship. They also sought to demonstrate the spiritual power of images by means of the very images in question. Indeed, the very first Gothic structure ever built, the famous Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, now in Paris, was redesigned in the 1140s in large part for this purpose. The creator of the building, Abbé Suger de Saint-Denis, wrote that he wanted to urge our dull minds upward from material things to immaterial things. He sought to achieve this end by visibly displaying invisible Christian truths, which meant especially exposing the true Christian meaning of Old Testament events, a form of allegory known as typology. Saint-Denis is also, and not coincidentally, the first work of visual anti-Jewish polemic. So let us look at this stained glass medallion that appears at the top of a window devoted to the life of Moses, which illustrates a scene from the book of Numbers. According to the book of Numbers 21, 5-9, during the period of wandering in the desert, God punished the Israelite people for impatience and rebelliousness by sending poisonous snakes among them. When the Israelites repented, God told Moses to make a brazen snake and put it up on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the brazen figure, he lived. In this medallion, Moses points to the effigy raised high on a column, while the serpents that had been afflicting the people flail at its foot, and two groups of people look on. The foremost figures in each group are bearded and wear pointed hats. That is, they are shown as Jews in features that have become standard by the 1140s as Jewish features. So at first glance, the medallion seems to be a straightforward, literal, and even sympathetic rendering of Hebrew history. But if we look very closely at the image of the brazen serpent, we see something unexpected. A crucifix rises out of the serpent's body. In fact, the episode of the brazen serpent was a popular proof text in Christian defenses of religious imagery. It was cited by both Abbot Gilbert Crispin and Abbot Rupert von Deutz in their anti-Jewish polemics to justify veneration of the crucifix. This panel, then, is a very clear and vivid manifesto in favor of Christian visual devotion, confidently proclaiming that the sight of the cross, like the vision of the brazen serpent, can bring life to those who look upon it. And now that we know this, we can see that the depiction of the Jews in the image is not wholly sympathetic. Instead, the image presents a spiritual hierarchy of vision and witness. Moses, the prophet who saves his people with the material object, that is, with the brazen serpent, but also provides them with texts, that is, the Hebrew scriptures, that, according to Christian interpretation, indicate the serpent's more transcendent meaning. This Moses is identical to traditional depictions of Christian apostles. That is, he is bareheaded, barefooted, bearded, and he has a halo around his head. The foremost figures among the Hebrews who look on are also treated quite respectfully. They are bearded and wear cloaks and pointed hats, similar to the Hebrew prophets that we saw earlier. But although these Hebrews, these Jews, have seen the brazen serpent and have come back to life, they do not see the body of Christ on the crucifix above the serpent. Their vision is blocked by the horizontal bar that extends above them. And on that bar, a third kind of Jewish witness is hinted at. For the inscription on the bar notes, "Just as the brazen serpent slays all other serpents, so Christ raised on the cross slays his enemies." These enemies of Christ are not depicted here in this medallion, unless we are to see them in the serpents that lie dead at Moses' feet. But the enemies of Christ will soon make their way into Christian art. This image comes from a German prayer book dating to the 1170s, known as the Stammheim Missal. In one sense, the image is deeply conventional. We have already seen an ivory book cover from the 9th century depicting synagoga, the personification of Judaism, standing beside the crucified Christ. But that earlier, discreetly veiled and blindfolded spinster can hardly be compared to this immodest young siren, whose hair and neck are so brazenly exposed, and who wears a hat properly belonging to an aged male prophet, not to a female personification. And who can see? For this synagoga's eyes, unlike almost every synagoga that preceded her in Christian art, are wide open. Moreover, she apparently both knows and hates what she is seeing. She carries a scroll saying, "Cursed be he who hangs on the tree," as she points malevolently at the dying Christ beside her. The ambivalence about Jewish vision and witness that we detected in the earlier Saint-Denis stained glass medallion is here converted into an actively hostile view of Jewish vision. And the long-standing veneration for Jewish antiquity seems here to have been turned into scorn and hostility. Note, too, the dark-faced, curved-nosed devil just below synagoga. His hideousness signifies his evil, an ominous foreshadowing of images of Jews and devils to come. Synagoga's malevolent stare is, moreover, paralleled in a host of artworks from roughly the same time and place, that show Jews glaring in anger at the crucified Christ, such as this Psalter from Bremen on the left, or this fragment of a gospel table manuscript from the Meuse Valley on the right. A fascinating text, roughly contemporary to these artworks, all of which date to about 1170, echoes this Christian concern about Jewish sight and also helps explain it. The text is known as the Opusculum, or the little work of Hermann the former Jew, and it purports to be the memoirs of a Christian monk, a Premonstratensian canon actually, who had been born a Jew named Judah, and who converted to Christianity as a young man. That would have been around the year 1127. Art played a surprisingly prominent role in Hermann Judah's spiritual autobiography. According to the text, when the author was just beginning to take an interest in Christianity, he walked into a Christian church and looked around him. 30 years later, this monk still remembered his powerful reaction to the artworks he saw there. This is what he says: "I gazed most eagerly, and I saw among the many artful varieties of carvings and pictures a particularly monstrous idol. To be exact, I discerned one and the same man, debased and exalted, despised and lifted up, ignominious and glorious. Below, he hung wretchedly on a cross. Above, by means of paintings' lies, he was enthroned, beautiful enough to seem to have been deified. I admit I was struck mute." Hermann the Jew didn't know what to think about this image. And here I have just created what I think he might have seen: a fresco of Christ in Majesty on a German chapel, and then the new kind of suffering Christ crucifix somewhere below, carved, less painted, and not wearing glorious clothing. Judah the Jew was not alone in expressing shock at Christ's wretched appearance. Although Christian devotional texts had long stressed Christ's humility, until about the year 1150, Christ was in fact portrayed in art as regal and proud. Only in the second half of the 12th century did artists begin to show Christ as naked, humbled, and dead or dying. These new images clearly posed a challenge to some Christian viewers who were used to revering an outwardly majestic Christ, and who lived in a world that still very much valued power and beauty, status and victory. Several surviving texts testify to the discomfort that some Christians felt regarding the new iconography. So, for example, in an anonymous Cistercian meditation on the crucifix dating to circa 1170, which was almost certainly inspired by a new style image of a dying Christ on the cross, Jesus on the cross implores the Christian gazing back at him not to be repelled by his outward ugliness. And this is a translation of the Latin meditation. "O my beloved, you who so often have desired to enjoy the kiss of my mouth, I am ready, I incline my head, I offer my mouth for a kiss. And do not you say in your heart, I do not seek that mouth which is without beauty and loveliness, but rather I seek that glorious one which the angelic citizens always desire to enjoy." Christ goes on, "Do not err thus, for unless first you will have kissed affectionately my unlovely mouth, you will not be able to reach the glorious one at all. Therefore, kiss that mouth which I now offer to you, since though it may be without beauty and loveliness, nevertheless it is not without grace." The Cistercian author of this meditation recognizes the potential for aesthetic and social revulsion in his readers, and by inspiring guilt for such revulsion, harnesses the very intensity of their distaste to devotional ends. Other texts address the same challenge in a different way, by hailing the ability to see beauty in a humbled Christ as a primary signifier of spiritual status, and by citing the Jews as exemplars of loveless looking. So, for example, St. Bernard of Clairvaux sought to promote love among potentially cold-hearted Christians by lamenting the Jews' pitiless response to the sight of Christ's sufferings. He wrote, "Neither Jew nor pagan feels the pangs of love as Ecclesia does. She sees the only begotten Son of the Father bearing the burden of his cross. She sees the Lord of majesty bruised and spat upon, the author of life and glory transfixed with nails, struck by the lance, flooded with mockery, and finally laying down his beloved soul for his friends. She sees this, and the sword of love pierces through her own soul too. In other words, she knows how to see with love, the Jews do not." The French abbot Peter the Venerable was clearly defending less than luxurious and decidedly non-triumphant depictions of Christ when he bellowed at the Jews, "What do you expect to see, Jews? Gold, silver, gems? Your own prophets said that Christ would come in humility." Blunter still is the caution proffered by the Cistercian abbot Geoffroy d'Auxerre, abbot of Clairvaux from 1163 to 1165, to novice monks striving to live spiritually in a material world. He wrote to them, "Do not be distracted by the exterior light, for Christ himself would have neither beauty nor grace were he viewed with Jewish eyes." Texts such as these help explain the new anti-Jewish imagery of the 1160s and the 1170s. If Christians railed against the inadequacy of Jews... I'm sorry, can you go back to 10? And back one more? Yes. If Christians railed against the inadequacy of Jews' vision, it was at least in part because they themselves often struggled and sometimes failed to see with the eyes of the heart, and that is a phrase used by Christian preachers over many centuries, to see with the eyes of the heart rather than the eyes of the body. Images such as the Stamheim Missal crucifixion with the glaring synagogue, and this Bremen Psalter, and this Belgian gospel table help Christians to see more properly by showing them how ugly loveless looking could be, and by associating such loveless looking with Jews. However, this is still only half the story. The images we have looked at so far are, I think, deeply hostile to select aspects of Judaism, but they do not, in my view, quite add up yet to a fully formed anti-Jewish visual polemic. This, I argue, is because in the 12th century, the church was still primarily concerned with internal church matters. The debates over allegorical interpretation, extravagant decoration, and image veneration, for example, were carried on largely by and among monks. In the early decades of the 13th century, however, a new breed of church reformers, based in cities and ministering to layfolk, began to turn their attention to the wider world around them. They sought to regulate the lives of their parishioners, to raise the morals of urban residents, and to unify the Christian city under the leadership of the Christian bishop, housed in the gloriously soaring new Gothic cathedrals rising across the continent. But when these teachers and preachers surveyed Christian society, they did not necessarily like what they saw. Scholastic texts complain about the negative effects of even positive change. Along with greater prosperity came materialism, social vice, spiritual malaise. This is not a problem that died in the 13th century, I think we can all acknowledge. That is, to many Christian clerics, Christians seem to be acting more like Jews, or at least as they imagine Jews to be. Indeed, around the year 1220, the abbot of one of the most respected monasteries in Paris, the monastery of Saint-Victor de Paris, complained that not only that his monks were exhibiting such typically Jewish vices as pride and luxury, but that they could be seen wearing typically Jewish clothing, sumptuous materials, bright colors, and even the dreaded pileus, the pointed cap by now closely associated with Jews. It is almost certainly for this reason that in the early 13th century, Christian clerics began for the first time to complain about the appearance of Jews. If you will remember, going back to Augustine, Jews were supposed to display Christian triumph through their own subordination and dejection. And yet, 13th century clerics could not help but notice that contemporary Jews did not look very dejected at all. Indeed, Jews were among the first to profit from the great economic and urban expansion of the High Middle Ages. I do not have time today to rehearse the many dozens of texts in which Christian clerics lament the ostentation of the Jews' houses, clothes, and synagogues, the power Jews wielded over their Christian debtors, the Jews' allegedly excessive influence at court, and the Jews' illegal exercise of high office. But I must note that the infamous Jewish badge decree of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 was imposed because the decree states Jews no longer dressed according to the law of Moses and were thus visually indistinguishable from Christians. Indeed, a church council in 1254 complained that Jews dressed the same as and could not be told apart from Christian clerics. Jews, too, expressed concern about identity confusion. Rabbis chastised young men for looking and dressing like Christians. The famous ascetic Rabbi Yehuda the Pious told a story about a Jew who went to hell because he refused to wear a beard. This disjunction, this distance between how Jews were theoretically supposed to look and how they really appeared, was underscored all the more by recent artistic trends. Just as Christians had become used to the sight of pointy-headed Hebrews in their works of art, they began to notice that there were very few pointy-hatted Jews in their own world. And I must repeat, all the texts suggest that Jews did not wear pointy hats in the first half of the 13th century. So this was the ultimate challenge for high medieval Christians. Just as their desire to reform the material world and to visually display Christian virtue was at its height, the visible world was changing in ways that widened the gap between theory and reality, inward truth and outward appearance. Neither the people of the letter, that is the Jews, nor the people of the Spirit, that is the Christians, saw, looked, or acted exactly as they were supposed to. Indeed, they were difficult to tell apart. But Christendom in the High Middle Ages was an energetic place, and the Church did not despair. A variety of means were devised to reimpose order on this chaotic situation. Clerics chastised Christian vice in their sermons and regulated Christian behavior in their laws. They also paid intensified and now highly hostile attention to previously neglected aspects of Jews' lives. I have already mentioned the imposition of a Jewish badge in 1215. This decree was reissued in varying forms throughout the 13th century, and new ways, too, were devised to restore Jews to their desired state of visual subjection. In a remarkable case of life imitating art, two church councils in 1267 ordered Jews to wear the so-called pileum cornutum, the pointed cap, as their, quote, ancestors used to do. And of course, Christians had no evidence for how Jews' ancestors used to dress, except the art Christians themselves had already created. But the most graphic, and perhaps ultimately the most powerful of all the means by which the Church tried to realize heavenly hierarchy on earth, was through art. In the first half of the 13th century, the full-blown anti-Jewish image was born. In artworks that now depicted not just abstract ideas or long-gone biblical events, but contemporary dreams and fears, the Jews' inner iniquity, so distressingly invisible to the naked eye, was now displayed for all to see. There were several steps to the process. First, the pointed hat was applied not just to ancient prophets, but to contemporary Jews, who looked a little different from their biblical ancestors, except perhaps in their ferocious expressions, but were now depicted committing various evil acts, acts that linked Jewish evil to exactly the stereotypically Jewish sins that Christians were increasingly displaying: greed, materialism, literalism, intellectual curiosity, and religious skepticism. This darkly scowling Jew in the red hat, for example, is accused in the accompanying text in this manuscript of seducing students, university students, away from the study of theology and toward more lucrative secular subjects. Next, the Jews' depravity was inscribed in their faces, as newly realistic physiognomic caricature implied that the Jews' evil essence was somehow or other tied to their inherited flesh. The 1233 caricature on the right demonstrates that the stereotype of the beaked, bent Jewish nose was a result, not a cause, of Jews' perceived connections to the devil. In other words, Jews were not hated because they looked different. Rather, they were portrayed as different because they were hated. And I say this because you can see the Jew's nose is being bent down by the devil. So the devil is making the Jew look more like himself. Finally, in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, after about 1300 and up until about 1500, these visual signs came to inhabit a wide repertoire of anti-Jewish artworks. Caricature Jews were depicted committing a host of nefarious brand new crimes, including abusing religious images. Here, a Jew puts an image of the Virgin Mary into a latrine. Desecrating the host. These are Jews supposedly piercing the host, a consecrated host, and making it bleed. And, as we have already heard and seen, most horrifying of all, murdering Christian children. Each of these accusations, I should note, was far more frequently hurled against Christians than against Jews. Christians were accused of desecrating images, were accused of abusing the consecrated host, and of course Christians were the majority of murderers in a majority Christian continent. As we have seen, clerics had long worried that Christians might not respond to artworks as they were supposed to, and in fact, many a Christian was punished for taking out their ire against images. Heretics and Christian renegades were suspected of scorning the host long before any Jew was ever accused of the act. And of course, it was Christians who committed the vast majority of violent crimes in the Middle Ages, including violence against children. Yet in picture after picture of such anti-Jewish libels, well-established symbols of Hebrew antiquity, such as pointed hats and beards, and somewhat newer symbols of Jewish materialism, such as coins and money bags, were combined with very innovative visual symbols of iniquity, such as the hooked and bent noses and distorted flesh, to ground the appalling new accusations in age-old stereotypes about the Jews. So this, I think, is the essential background to the anti-Jewish images and accusations of 18th century Sandomierzu. At no point, I think, did medieval Catholic clerics or artists consciously set out to create an anti-Jewish visual repertoire, much less to inspire anti-Jewish violence or retribution. Rather, when Christian clerics needed to think about how to see and understand the visible and material world, they turned to a figure that had long stood in their tradition for materialism and visibility. In the first stage, around 1085, as Gregorian reformers were engaged in radically changing their world, archaizing depictions of Hebrew prophets helped ground the innovations in authoritative tradition. 60 years later, at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, antique Jews confirmed the usefulness of church art as an initial step toward religious illumination, but they also embodied the difference between earthbound, literalistic, and spiritual seeing. Later still in the 12th century, depictions of Jews glowering at a humbled Christ exaggerated their defiance and hostility in order to provide a countermodel for Christian viewers just beginning to get used to new art forms. And in the 13th century and beyond, swarthy, hook-nosed usurers and host desecrators served to correct disturbing truths that Catholic clerics knew only too well. Good people don't always see what they're supposed to see, Christians don't always act as they are supposed to act, and bad people cannot always be recognized by their faces. But that simple, unsettling message was all too soon overridden by the power of the images made to convey it. The irony, or perhaps the tragedy, of this story is that images made specifically to critique imperfect sight were themselves misunderstood by their viewers. Although the main goal, I firmly believe, of Christian art was to help cleanse Christians of sin, this, of course, was never fully achieved. Instead, the gradual emergence of the Jew as sign and witness in medieval Christian art paralleled and even helped cause the gradual disappearance of the Jew as sign and witness from the medieval Christian West.